Greetings and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Joining me again today, as he does each and every week, is Chalkboard's K-12 editor, Brendan Clary. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing all right, Dan. How about yourself?
Doing well, thank you. We are recording this on Monday, December 11th. Brendan, the U.S. Department of Education is now expected to finalize these new rules that would ban statewide prohibitions on transgender athletes from participating in a sport that match their gender identity as opposed to their biological gender. Anyway, those new rules are expected to be finalized in March 2024. We initially expected them out this past October, just a few months ago. There are many critics who say biological males should not play female sports, not in K-12 education, not in higher education. You wrote about this update at Chalkboard News. Tell our listeners what they need to know.
Yeah, so I reported on this and we talked about it recently, but essentially, this Title IX change is specific to the athletics. The one that I wrote about which it basically overrides statewide bans on transgender athletes participating in a sport that matches their gender identity, right? So if you are a transgender female, this would allow you to play on a girls' sports team. And if your state has a prohibition, it would basically strike that prohibition from transgender athletes participating. So it'd be more of a case-by-case basis where school officials would have to try to evaluate questions about fairness, questions about safety. And it has sort of a roadmap to try to figure that out on a case-by-case basis. And so it would remove some of these blanket bans that some states have enacted against transgender athletes participating in the sports that match their gender identity. And so critics have said, it would kind of create a mismatch, sort of a lot of different kinds of players, maybe different standards across different school districts, and that there'd be other concerns about fairness and safety. So that's something that Republican governors and superintendents, a number of them responded to the rules with these letters that were describing, the legality of this. And so some Republican governors, and I covered this much earlier this year when the comments were being submitted to this rule, this notice of proposed rulemaking. It's kind of got some complex legal regulatory terminology there. So it's technically a notice of proposed rulemaking, which gets just kind of into the weeds of it. And these are all on kind of obscure government pages to try to find out where these are and what the progress is. So essentially, these Republican governors have said, this would basically rewrite the law without congressional approval. And this would sort of completely change wholesale what the meaning of the law is to expand into gender identity, whereas before this has been understood to protect sexual characteristics, right, and on the basis of sex. So that's one of the bigger questions that this raises, and that the change would enact. But essentially, after the notice of proposed rulemaking was published and the comments were submitted, it got a ton of comments, and that's what the Department of Education has pointed to for the delays. I think they got 140,000 on this one. There was hundreds of thousands of comments on a related Title IX rule that would change the definition to expand into gender identity. So it'd be very similar, and it would tie federal funding to complying with that gender identity aspect. And that's something that Casey Harper for the Center Square, which is also owned by the Franklin News Foundation, he covered this as well. And he's covered this. It would impact the USDA's free and reduced price lunch program. Basically, schools would have to be in compliance with the Title IX's understanding of gender identity in order to get federal funds, in order to be eligible for the USDA's free and reduced lunch program. So these have wide-ranging effects, right? So you have to have, bathroom access for transgender students or for students on their gender identity. And so it really kind of does enlarge the scope of the Title IX law, the civil rights and education law. So these are wide-standing things, and they've received a lot of criticism from conservatives and from Republican lawmakers recently.
So let's go back, specifically focus on the transgender sports issue. Safety, of course, has been an issue. You've written about at least a few examples where a biological female, a girl, has been hurt by a transgender female, a biological male who identifies as female, who's played in these sports. You've written about that issue. So these new rules go in play. There's plenty of opposition to these new rules, right? Are we expecting this to be decided in the courts like just about everything else nowadays, that if these rules do go into effect, which it looks like they will, whether it's March or whenever, there's going to be challenges to these new rules because, one, as you mentioned, they aren't congressionally approved. The Biden administration is doing this, significantly reinterpreting Title IX from what the intended initial rule was. So is that the expectation here?
Yeah, I would imagine that it would face legal challenges. And I think that we've seen that, the Supreme Court, this is sort of tangentially related to that, but they've limited the scope of the government's regulatory power, I think, in a recent West Virginia v. EPA ruling. And that was a few years ago from what I remember. But if I'm remembering that correctly, the Supreme Court said, the EPA cannot have as broad of a regulatory power as it said that it should have, or that it thought it should have. So I imagine that this would face legal challenges. I mean, we've seen broad support from Republican governors against this. And, they were using legal terms of, this would rewrite the law, this usurps power from Congress. And so there are these challenges, I think, on the face of it that it would see. So I imagine that it would be pretty litigious, as these come out, and maybe on a, statewide level as well, seeing what happens with this. I imagine we'll see more lawsuits coming up about this. And that's something that I've covered about in Chalkboard as well, is, we have seen parental notification policy lawsuits. We've seen, just kind of a whole host of parental rights lawsuits and First Amendment lawsuits from teachers about those kinds of things. So I think that this kind of this goes alongside that. And this has been a big cultural topic where there has been a lot of litigation. And so I think that is a natural outcome of this, is that it would get caught up in the courts and that it might go all the way up to the Supreme Court. I would not be surprised at all if that happened. But again, I'm just kind of guessing here, and I can't tell the future. So but yeah, I mean, I think when this stuff happens, and you feel you have people on the other side of that saying, we do not agree with this and we don't think that this is legal, then you kind of get those challenges, right?
Well, and our listeners and myself can keep up with any of those developments, including any legal challenges, at chalkboardnews.com. But we are out of time. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.